selling a rental property with tenants. Hey guys, it's Brad from Georgia Probate Resource. We're a real estate solutions company in Metro Atlanta, but we buy houses all over the state of Georgia, and we specialize in the world of probate and inheritance properties. All right, so let's get to it today. So selling a rental property with tenants. This obviously applies to probate and inheritance, but it also applies to just if you're a landlord and you want to sell a property with tenants. We buy properties with tenants all the time. Very common, done many of them over the years, had to do some evictions, had to do some cash for keys, had some great tenants, had some bad tenants, you name it, run the gamut, right? And we've dealt with it all, okay? And I'm also a landlord myself, so I have tenants of my own that occupy my rental properties, and also do some seller financing stuff. So when you are selling a rental property with tenants in place, you want to do a few things. Number one, and a lot of people don't do this, but if at all possible, you need to make sure you're notifying the tenants that you're selling the property. We have had instances where they didn't notify the tenants that the property was being sold. While the lease carries through, any lease agreements carry through to, the new landlord when they buy it, it still creates some heartburn. And, imagine, just put yourself in the shoes of the tenant. Imagine that if you were living in a house and all of a sudden you found out that your rental property that you're renting was just sold to somebody else. What do you think? Like, you're going to be like, oh crap, are they going to kick me out? Like, am I going to have to move? What's going to happen, right? Imagine the anxiety that you're causing the tenant. So put yourself in their shoes, right? Also, you need to figure out, which you probably already know this, is there a lease or is there not a lease, right? If you have a written lease, is it up to date? Make sure you're providing that written lease to anybody who buys the property, because that written lease is applicable and does carry forward to the new landlord or the new owner. So you need to make sure that you're giving that information. Or is there no lease? Are you on a month-to-month sort of verbal tenancy? Did you have a lease once upon a time and now you're month-to-month, right? You need to make sure that you're very clear about the terms of the lease. A lot of times it's just a handshake agreement. We've dealt with that many, many times. The thing that we typically do in those instances, on my end as the buyer buying the property, is, and this is very common in commercial real estate, if you don't have a written agreement in place, I, as the buyer, I typically like to prepare a document, which is very common in commercial real estate, called a tenant estoppel agreement. And all that is a document that we sign at before closing, that is signed by both the landlord, the tenant, and the buyer. And it outlines the terms of the rental agreement. It outlines the monthly lease amount. It outlines the notices, which is typically, if there's no lease in place, it's going to be whatever your state laws are. In Georgia, it's a 60-day notice. And it's going to outline whether there are not security deposits, whether there was any sort of lease with an option to purchase involved. All of that is going to be laid out in that document and signed by all the parties, so that there's no question as to what the terms of the agreement are. If you're selling the property, are you going to give your tenants a notice to vacate? So we typically do this. I don't like to inherit tenants, and sometimes I do, and I've inherited tenants and had some really good tenants. I had one tenant I inherited, and he was with me for a couple years after that. But typically, the previous landlord didn't do a very good job of screening the tenants, or maybe they don't fit my sort of criteria for the property. So I typically want to get a tenant out of the property when I buy it and go get my own, or I want to make improvements to the property and then release the property. So I'm gonna, what I do a lot of times is I'll actually issue a notice to vacate. I'll have the seller that's selling us the property issue a notice to vacate to the tenant, so that clock is ticking at that point. Because typically, if you're on a month-to-month tenancy, here in the state of Georgia, it requires 60 days written notice to the tenant that they need to vacate. So we will have the landlord or the seller issue a notice to vacate as soon as we go under contract, so that by the time we close, that clock is already ticking where they have to be out by a certain date. That way, I don't wait until I get in and then issue them notice to vacate, and then it's another 60 days, right? So you need to make sure that you're giving your tenant proper notice. If you are going to give them a notice to vacate, you got to make sure you follow the laws. Or if you do have a written lease agreement in place, You want to make sure that you are following whatever the terms of that lease are. Also, you need to understand that if you are, and this is probably the most important point of this video, which is if you are selling a property with tenants in place, you need to understand that you have immediately very narrowed your buyer pool. And what do I mean by that? Okay, so imagine that you are a home buyer and you are out looking for your dream home to buy, to move into, right? And you found this property that you really, really love, and you find out that this property is tenant occupied. First of all, you might not even want to look at the property at all. Second of all, let's say they do go look at the property. Let's say you go look at the property. Remember, we're in the shoes of the potential buyer here. They're going to look at the property and they'll be like, more than likely, this person doesn't know anything about real estate. They just want to buy a house to live in. So they're going to say, well, like, what do I do with the tenant? I don't want to buy a rental property. Like, I want to move into my new house the day I buy it. I don't want to wait 60 days for this tenant to move out. So what does that mean? Well, that means a lot of people are not even going to bother looking at the house in the first place because they know that it's tenant occupied, or their agent is not going to show them that property because it's tenant occupied. So boom, you just reduced your buyer's pool significantly from that point. Second of all, of the buyers that are interested, they're probably going to be more real estate savvy. They're probably going to be investors. And what do investors care about more than anything? Investors care about ROI, return on investment. So me as an investor, if I'm buying a rental property, I'm calculating, it's all just a math formula to me, and I'm looking at it and saying, am I going to get a return on investment? If I invest, $200,000 into this property or whatever it is, what is my rate of return on that investment going to be? And if I'm not getting a return on my investment, it's probably not a good investment, right? So what does that mean, and why am I saying that? Well, the reason I'm saying that is because more often than not, we're buying properties from people who either were accidental landlords or they bought this property just to park some money somewhere. And from a ROI perspective, this rental is pretty bad. So give you a great example, right? We're looking at a property at the moment to buy. It's actually a package of properties from an estate situation. They inherited a whole portfolio of rentals. And these properties are in a great area. In fact, one of them is literally a mile away from my house where I live. They're great properties, but they're not good rental properties. And what happened was, once upon a time, many years ago, their dad bought all these properties and basically parked his money in these properties and bought them for appreciation. And he put tenants in them. And at the time, they were cash flowing great. But now that the market is appreciated today, these properties are worth almost double what he bought them for. So now his heirs want to sell these properties that are all tenant occupied, leases in place, and they want to sell them for basically market value, which is one of them is $350,000. And he's like, oh, well, there's a tenant in place and they're paying rent. Okay, great. Well, what is the tenant paying in rent? $1,700 a month. Okay, $1,700 in rent on a $350,000 investment is a terrible rate of return. Horrible. You should just throw your money into a savings account instead of buying that rental property. A, because you're buying at the peak of the market right now. You're not buying in the trough. And then B, because those cash flow numbers don't make any sense. So me as an investor, I look at that and say, this is not really a very appealing rental property to me because I'm going to have a negative ROI. I'm going to lose money by buying this property. Now, I could wait out the amount of time until that lease is up and then kick the tenant out of there and probably just rehab the house and sell it retail, because really a lot of these properties are really more retail, owner-occupied buyer. They're not really good rental properties. So from my perspective, I'm not really interested in it. So what does that mean on the flip side for the seller or the estate who's selling these properties? Well, they want to sell these properties, but they're having a tough time finding buyers to buy these properties tenant occupied because A, the buyers on the open market want to live in the property, and B, the investors that are looking at these deals are like, nah, no thanks. I'm not really interested in that. Doesn't really make any sense. If you could get these tenants out of the property, I might be more interested because then I could buy it to flip, right? But then at the same token, once you get the tenants out, maybe you should just sell the property retail, but it probably needs a little bit of work. Are you willing to put carpet, paint, spend, honestly, most of our rehabs nowadays, just carpet and paint is $25,000 to $30,000 to do flooring and paint on a lot of these projects. Replacing some light fixtures, doing flooring and paint, appliances, we're spending 25 or 30 grand. So are you willing to put $25,000 to $30,000 into this property to get it ready to sell once you've kicked the tenant out? Are you willing to go through all that? Well, great. You're going to get a killer return on your money. If you're not willing to mess with all that, you've got to accept the fact and understand that your buyer is probably going to be an investor, and they're strictly looking at this from a return on investment standpoint. And don't be offended when they make you a lowball offer, because literally they're just calculating what their return on investment would be, and they're buying it at the number that makes sense for them. If it doesn't make sense for them, they don't buy it. Same with me. I'm an investor. If the numbers don't make sense for me, I don't buy it. I'm not emotionally attached to any property. It's strictly a math problem. Does it work or does it not work? Yes or no? Doesn't? Great. Move on. Next. Okay. I know that sounds a little bit harsh, but that's literally all it is. This is an investment business for me. So anyways, I hope that helps answer some questions about selling a rental property with tenants in place. Again, if you have a property that you need to sell, we'd love to take a look at it. We buy houses all over Georgia. Also, I am a licensed agent. If you want to go the traditional route and list the property, I'm a licensed agent with One Source in Woodstock. I'd be happy to talk to you about listing the property. But if you want an easy, fast cash offer, you don't want to mess with it, you just want to sell it, we'd be happy to make you an offer on the property. So please reach out to us. You can click on our website. You can go to probateresource.com or georgiaprobateresource.com. Any way you want to spell Georgia, we own all those domains. Be happy to take a look at it. So thanks again for your time today. Again, I'm Brad. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.